Developers need to be able to read and understand code written by others. This can be a difficult task depending on the complexity of the code, which is why metrics are often used to measure the code's complexity. Unfortunately, commonly used metrics can often be ineffective.
There could be actually two reasons for this. One is that the metrics are not very good yet, and they don't really capture the complex elements of the code. And another possible reason is that actually the code itself is not the main problem. And during the research, what we found is that actually maybe the code is not the main problem. And maybe the discrepancies between the developer that wrote the code and the developer that's trying to read it, maybe that's also part of the problem.
Dror Feitelson set up 3 experiments to study the relationship between code complexity and code comprehension.
So one of the problems with McCabe's supermatic complexity is that all of the branching constructs are given the same weight. So what we wanted to do is actually perform an experiment that checks whether different constructs should have the same weights or not. And we did that by creating multiple snippets of code, and all of these snippets of code had exactly the same functionality, but it was expressed in different ways using different constructs. And we think that our hypothesis is that if it takes developers more time to understand something, if they make more errors, then this version is more complicated than another version. The second experiment is very similar in the sense that we give developers code that they need to understand, but this time it's a whole function, it's a much longer code. This code also has 2 versions. One version is what we call a regular version, and the other is non-regular. And regular means that the code has certain elements which are repeated. And the way we tried to measure this is that we use an eye tracker to identify where the developers were looking on the screen when they were reading the code. And we measured how much time they spent on each of the instances of the repeated code structure. And indeed we found that they spent much more time on the initial instances and much less time on the subsequent instances. So the complexity is not an absolute measure, it's a relative measure. It depends where you are in the sequence. The relative complexity or the apparent complexity changes. So the study was more not about sort of the structure of the code as much as the names of the variables in the code. And what we did in this study is we wanted to check how important meaningful names are. So what we did is, again, we took code. In this case, it was not code written specifically for the experiment. It was code from utility libraries in GitHub. We took this code as it was, as it appeared as the developers on GitHub wrote it. And then we created a second version in which we replaced all the variable names simply by letters of the alphabet in order of appearance. And then we gave developers this code and we asked them to understand it.
Surprisingly, the developers that gave incorrect answers were all from the group given the original variable names. The conclusion from this experiment is that names do not always help comprehension, but can actually be unintentionally misleading.
The take-home message here is that we need a much deeper understanding of the cognitive processes of understanding code, which we don't have yet. So we need to interact with cognitive scientists and psychologists, and we need to do studies on the way people think about code, things which we have so far done very, very little of. And only then we will be able to really understand program understanding at a deeper level.
Learn more in the contributed article From Code Complexity Metrics to Program Comprehension in the May 2023 Communications of the ACM.